The snow arrived 3 weeks early, the way bad news always did in the Animas Fork Valley, without warning, without apology, without any concern for what a person had left to prepare. Wren Calloway stood at the kitchen window with both hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching the flakes come down on the roof of the lean-to where half a cord of unseasoned pine sat uncovered in the dark. She had meant to get to it. She had meant to do a great many things before the first snow came. The cabin was 12 by 14 feet, built for two people in their first hopeful year, expanded once when Ida was born, and never again. The roof had three soft spots she could locate by memory, one above the iron stove, one above the corner where the children slept, one above the door that had been swelling in its frame since the August rains. Cormac had meant to re-shingle before September. Cormac had meant to split 4 cords before October. Cormac had been in the ground since the 14th of April, and the roof still leaked, the door still stuck, the wood still sat green and damp under open sky. Wren set the cup on the windowsill without drinking from it. She was not crying. She had not cried at the burial, not in the 6 months since, not on the night she lay on the floor beside the children's bed, because there was no room for her in it, and she could not bring herself to move any of them to make room. Something had closed in her chest the morning she watched Cormac's lungs stop working, some internal door pulled shut by a hand she did not recognize as her own, and she had not found the latch since. What she felt instead of grief was arithmetic. Numbers arranged themselves in her mind with the cold precision of a man doing accounts by lamplight, each column reducing to a sum she did not want to reach. 52 days until the killing freeze by her reckoning. The Valley Almanac said 60, but the almanac had been wrong about August, wrong about September, wrong in every direction that cost a person something. She trusted her own bones over the almanac, and her bones said 52. $11 in the pocket of her work apron. A $5 note folded to the size of a postage stamp, 6 singles worn soft as cloth from handling. She had counted them 4 times in the past week, the way a person counts something they know has not changed, hoping the count will come out different. Half a cord of pine under open sky green from August, cutting wet from 3 days of October rain. Even seasoned pine burned poorly in a sealed space when the temperature dropped below zero. Wet green pine in a small cabin with a stove that drew poorly was a slower version of a problem she had seen end a family outside Ridgeway Creek in the winter of 1879. The Folger family, father 41, mother 37, 3 children between 4 and 9, found arranged as though sleeping. The woodpile outside had been oak, not pine, but it had frozen through in a November sleet before it could drain, and the smoke it produced had done its work quietly while they slept. Wren had been to that cabin with Cormac 2 days after. She had not forgotten the smell or the arrangement of their arms. She was 44 years old. Her children were 12, 9, and 6. She had no intention of being found arranged as though sleeping. She walked to the children's bed. Ida lay on her side with one arm across her younger brother, the protective geometry of a child who had absorbed more of the household's anxiety than any 12-year-old should carry, and had organized it into the language of her body, the positioned arm, the slight furrow between her brows even in sleep. Amos slept with both fists curled against his chest, the same posture he had held every night since April, as though he were bracing against something that never quite arrived. Pearl lay on her back with her mouth open and one foot sticking out past the quilt's edge. Wren tucked the foot back under without waking her. Pearl sighed, shifted, pressed her face into the pillow, and went on sleeping with the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old who believed without question that her mother had the situation in hand. Wren stood looking at the 3 of them for longer than she intended. The lamp was burning low. Outside, the snow was thickening. She understood, standing there in the half-dark with her children's breathing, as the only sound in the room, that the decision she needed to make was not a decision at all. It was an acknowledgement. The cabin would not hold them through winter. The math did not work. The roof did not work. The wood supply did not work. Staying here was not a choice that led anywhere she intended to go. She crossed to the trunk at the foot of the bed. Her father, Elias Pratt, had built the trunk from chestnut in the winter of 1838, when Wren's mother was expecting her first child. Elias had been a stonemason and a miner, a man who had spent 40 years in conversation with the earth of the Appalachian Highlands, learning what it would hold and what it would not, what could be coaxed from it, and what had to be taken by understanding rather than force. He had taught Wren to read the grain of stone before he taught her to read print. He had shown her how to find the fault lines in a rock face by the color changes no bigger than a hand's width, how to tell from a slope's angle where water traveled in winter, how to hear the difference between earth that was settled and earth that was still deciding. He died when she was 18. She had carried the trunk from Tennessee to Colorado Territory when she was 22, following Cormac west with everything she owned and very little she would eventually need. Beneath the wedding shawl she had worn once beneath the christening gown, all three children had worn beneath the pressed tobacco flower from a garden in Tennessee she had not seen in 22 years. The notebook lay wrapped in oiled cloth tied with a length of cord. She lifted it out and set it on her knees. 40 years of her father's observations compiled in the careful hand of a man who had never gone to school past age 12, but whose precision of thought had made formal education beside the point. Drawings of dry-stacked stone shelters that Appalachian miners had used for generations, the stones fitted without mortar into geometries that resisted frost heave and shed snow by angle rather than by mass. Notes on clay compositions which creek clays held their matrix when frozen, which fractured, which required what fiber additions to bridge the gap between liquid application and permanent structure. Diagrams of sapling frame arches, the technique of bending green wood into a fixed curve and bracing it until the wood seasoned into that shape permanently, carrying the memory of the bend in its grain for as long as the wood stood. Elias had written in the margins in his compressed hand, "A young tree remembers what you teach it. An old tree has already decided what it knows." Wren had read the notebook twice in the year after Elias died, then placed it in the trunk and not opened it again. She had been a wife. She had been a mother. She had not needed to be her father's apprentice. She turned to the page with the arch diagrams. Her finger traced the measurements. 14-foot spans, 8-foot standing height at center, anchor posts set 20 inches deep. The green wood required was cottonwood or willow, both of which grew in quantity along the Animas Fork within a quarter mile of where she currently sat. Behind her a sound, Ida's voice pitched low to avoid waking the others. Wren didn't turn around. She heard her daughter sit up in the bed, heard the small creak of the rope frame. The lamp threw their shadows long against the wall. Wren's bent over the notebook, Ida's straight and watching. Ida's voice came again. "Mama, are you scared?" Wren did not turn around. She did not want her daughter to see her face in that moment. Not because she was crying, she was not, but because what was on her face was something she hadn't finished sorting, and it wasn't right to hand it to a 12-year-old unprocessed. "No," Wren said. Silence. Then Ida, "I am." Wren closed the notebook and held it against her chest. The oiled cloth was smooth under her palms. She breathed once slowly, the kind of breath a person takes not for air, but for time. "I know, baby," Wren said. "Sleep now." "Mama." A pause. "We can't stay here, can we?" Wren turned then. Ida was sitting up with her braid fallen over one shoulder. Her father's particular quality of attention in her eyes, the way Cormac had looked at a problem before speaking, measuring it from all angles first. 12 years old, and she had already arrived at the same calculation her mother had been running for 3 days. "No," Wren said. "We can't." Ida received this with a single nod, the nod of someone whose private calculation had just been confirmed, and lay back down. She didn't close her eyes immediately. She watched the ceiling with the settled expression of a person who has accepted a difficult fact and is now simply waiting to find out what comes next. Wren held the notebook until the lamp wick began to sputter, then blew it out and lay down on the floor beside the bed, on the folded quilt she kept there for this purpose, and listened to the snow against the tin roof and counted the days until the deep cold and did not sleep. The morning came gray and sharp. Wren was up before the children, building the fire in the iron stove with the last of the dry kindling, setting water to boil, cutting the remaining half loaf of bread into portions she had calculated the night before. The snow had stopped. 6 inches on the ground, enough to show her the angle at which it had drifted against the north wall of the cabin, confirming what she already knew about the gap between the wall planks she had been meaning to chink since August. She was standing at the stove with a second cup of coffee, this one she intended to drink when the knock came. Declan Calloway was Cormac's younger brother, 5 years younger, a blacksmith by trade, who had their mother's coloring and their father's caution. He came in with his hat in both hands, the hat working between his fingers, in the particular way of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say and is not certain the rehearsal was sufficient. 3 steps behind him came his wife Vera, whose red hair was pinned with the precision of a woman who dressed carefully before making any trip she considered consequential. Vera's eyes moved around the cabin with the systematic quality of an appraiser. She had been in this room before at the wedding, at each of the children's births twice for Christmas in the early years, but her eyes had the specific focus now of someone cataloging rather than visiting. The split log table, the iron stove, the trunk at the foot of the bed, the gap in the roof boards above the stove that Wren had been patching from inside with strips of canvas. Declan cleared his throat. "Sister, we've been talking, Vera and me. We think you and the children should come stay with us through the winter, until you can figure something more permanent." Wren set her cup down. She indicated the 2 chairs at the table. She poured coffee for both of them, though she knew Vera wouldn't touch hers. Vera took the chair nearer the window. Declan sat with his hat on his knee, still working the brim. "Our Frederick can move to the kitchen loft," Declan continued. "The girls can double up. It won't be comfortable, but it's warm and it's solid, and the roof—" He glanced up at the canvas patch above the stove. "The roof won't leak." The children were awake now, Ida watching from the bed with her quiet assessment, Amos sitting up with his fists already formed against his thighs, Pearl climbing into Wren's lap the moment Wren sat down, wedging herself there with the single-minded purpose of a small child who has identified the most secure position in the room. Wren let the silence do some work before she spoke. "Declan, I appreciate what you've come to say. I do. You are a good brother and Cormac would be grateful." Declan's shoulders loosened slightly. "But we will not be coming to stay with you." Vera's cup didn't move. Neither did Vera's expression precisely, but something rearranged itself behind her eyes. Declan set his cup down. "Wren, I've been up thinking about this since—" "I've been thinking about it too," Wren said. "I've decided what's best for my children is for us to find our own place. Something I can manage. Something that's ours." She felt Pearl press closer against her ribs. "My children are going to grow up. When they do, I want them to remember their mother as someone who built something with her own hands, not someone who scrubbed another family's floors for the right to sleep in their extra room." Vera's voice arrived in the room at a controlled volume that suggested it had been waiting its turn for some time. "Wren, with respect, you don't understand the practicalities. You have $11. I happened to see it when you were reaching for the coffee." The room was very quiet. "I know what I have," Wren said. "You have 3 children and a roof with soft spots and a woodpile that won't make it to December." Vera's voice was not unkind in its delivery, which made it harder to object to. "What you do not have is a plan." "I have a plan. What I don't have yet is a site." It was Declan who spoke next, and when he did, the words came out with the specific shape of something that had been held too long, something that had compressed in storage and was now larger than the container had led him to expect. "Wren, there is something I have to tell you." Vera's head turned toward him. "Declan." "She has to know, Vera." He was looking at the table. He would not look at Wren. "In March, when Cormac was getting worse and the doctor from Denver said there was a treatment, something they were trying in the city, he came to me." Declan's hand stilled on the hat brim. "He borrowed $50 for the medicine. He said he'd pay it back when the spring work came in. And then he couldn't work, and then—" He stopped. The word then hung in the room like smoke that had nowhere to go. Vera's voice, when it came, had the texture of something long prepared. "We have 5 children of our own. 5 mouths. We can't simply forgive $50 on sentiment. It isn't about Cormac, God rest him. It's about fairness." Wren looked at her brother-in-law, not at Vera, at Declan, who was studying the table with the focus of a man who would very much like to be somewhere his wife could not see his face. She had known Declan Calloway for 22 years. She had watched him become year by year a man who had traded his own voice for the specific quiet of a house where someone else made the hard decisions. She felt no anger at him for it. What she felt was closer to the particular sorrow of recognizing something that could not be fixed by wanting it to be otherwise. 60 days, Wren said. "Give me 60 days, Declan. I will have your $50. Declan looked up. "Wren, 60 days, you have my word." He nodded once. Vera made a small sound that might have been satisfaction at the dead acknowledged or disappointment that the conversation had not stretched longer. They left a few minutes afterward, Vera 3 steps behind Declan on the path, both of them disappearing around the stand of cottonwoods toward the road. Wren stood in the doorway until they were out of sight, then closed the door and turned back to her children. Amos was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face in 6 months. Not the tight anger that had lived behind his eyes since April. Something more open than that. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like he was paying attention to his mother for the first time since his father stopped being someone he could pay attention to instead. She did not explain the conversation. She did not translate the $50 into what it meant for their situation. She called all three of them to her, sat down on the floor so she was level with them, and spoke plainly. "Children, we are going to build a house." "Pearl, where?" "I don't know yet. We're going to go find the place." Amos looked at her with an expression that was calculating something. "A real house. A small one. Very small, but real. Ours." Pearl's face arranged itself into a question that Wren recognized before the words came. "Will Papa live there too?" Amos turned away from his mother toward the window. His jaw was set. But before Wren could find the words, Ida spoke quietly in the tone she had apparently been developing in the months since April, to handle the questions that landed between what was true and what a 6-year-old could hold. "Papa goes where we go, Pearl," Ida said. "He's not in any building anymore. He's in us." Pearl considered this with the solemnity of a child evaluating a new piece of information against her existing understanding of the world. Then she nodded once satisfied and turned to the business of tugging at the fraying edge of Wren's apron hem. They walked out along the Animus Fork after breakfast, the four of them heading south from the cabin along the creek path. The snow had been walked down to mud in the traveled sections and crunched in the untouched places along the bank. The cottonwoods were losing their last yellow leaves. Pearl's legs were short, so their pace was a child's pace, unhurried, which gave Wren time to read the land, the way her father had taught her, not looking for what was there, but for what the land was doing, where it was moving, where it was resting, where it had already decided something without consulting anyone. She was watching the slope angles, the way the north-facing hillside on the eastern bank accumulated snow against its base versus what was exposed at mid-slope. She was watching where the wind came through the canyon and where it deflected. She was watching for rock, not the loose talus that shifted with every freeze-thaw cycle, but bedrock close enough to the surface to serve as a permanent wall without excavation. Ida walked beside her, naming things quietly the way she had done since she learned words: the creek, the willows, a red-tailed hawk quartering the field above the tree line. Amos walked 10 feet behind, kicking stones into the current with a force that exceeded what the act required. He had been doing this since April. Wren let him do it. The stones were not her concern. What happened inside the boy who was kicking them was her concern, but the kicking was serving a function she hadn't found a replacement for yet. A quarter-mile south of the lumber company's staging area, the canyon walls closed in on the east side, and the hillside steepened to an angle Wren could calculate by sight. Snow hitting that slope above the 40-foot line would redirect north and west, carried by the prevailing canyon wind down and away from anything built low against the vein of exposed rock she could see emerging from the hillside maybe 30 feet above the creek bank. The rock slide had happened a long time ago. Lichen had colonized most of the exposed faces, the gray-green crust that meant decades of stillness. It had left a natural concavity in the hillside, a curve of stone that sheltered inward from the northwest, roughly semicircular at its mouth, perhaps 12 feet across, cutting back 6 or 7 feet at its deepest point. The geometry was not accidental, but it was not deliberate either. It was simply what the rock had been doing before anyone arrived to put a name on it. Wren walked to the back wall of the hollow and placed her palm flat against the stone. Nothing moved. The rock was cold and solid under her hand. She pressed, testing. The surface held with the particular resistance of something that had been deciding what it was for considerably longer than she had been alive. She looked at the angle of the overhang above, enough to deflect a moderate load, not enough to catch the deep accumulation that would come in January when the storm system stacked up against the Continental Divide to the north. She did the calculation. A fire inside this space with the rock face as the back wall would warm the stone over 3 or 4 hours of burning. Rock held heat for 8 to 10 hours after the fire went out. In a properly sealed space of this size, with the right wood dry and clean, she could keep 3 children alive through a Colorado winter on 2 cords instead of 4. "Mama," Ida's voice behind her, "is this where—" "Yes," Wren said. Ida stood at the mouth of the hollow with her hands folded in front of her, the way she stood when she was working through a geometry problem on her school slate. She looked at the curved walls, the inward ceiling, the way the stone caught the thin October light. It's very small. It will be enough. Enough for what? Wren turned to look at her daughter. There was no challenge in the question. Ida did not challenge, she examined. She wanted to understand the terms before accepting them. Enough for the winter, Wren said. Enough to get us to spring. Enough to build something else from. Ida received this. Then, what is it you're going to build first, Mama, before the house? What's the first thing? Wren looked at her daughter's face in the gray October light and found for the first time in 6 months something that was not the cold arithmetic in her chest. Not hope exactly, it was too small for that word, too cautious, too aware of everything that could still go wrong. But it occupied the territory adjacent to hope, the place between grief and the next thing. A woodshed, Wren said. The wood is what keeps us alive. The wood has to stay dry. Dry wood is the difference between warm sleep and the other kind. She sat down on a flat rock at the hollow's mouth and looked at her daughter. Sit down, Ida. I'm going to tell you what your grandfather taught me when I was your age. Amos had drifted closer while she was talking, the way he drifted closer to things that interested him when he didn't want to admit they interested him. He stood 6 feet away, with his boot at a stone he had apparently decided not to kick his eyes, not quite on his mother, but not elsewhere either. Pearl climbed into Wren's lap and fell asleep against her shoulder within 4 minutes, which was the specific gift. Pearl had the ability to sleep anywhere immediately at the first available warmth. Wren talked. She talked about her father's notebook, the drawings she had studied the night before. She talked about the Appalachian miners who had been building dry-stack stone shelters without mortar since before the Revolution, structures that could withstand frost heave and snow load, and 30 years of mountain weather, because they were built with the grain of the land rather than against it. She talked about Greenwood and what it remembered about the physics of an arch, about why a dome shed load where a flat surface collected it. She talked about clay and what it needed to stop cracking when it froze. She talked about her father's hands, which had been permanently darkened by years of working Tennessee limestone, and about the way he had pressed her own small hands against a rock face when she was 7 years old, and asked her what she felt. Amos was 4 feet away by the time she finished. He was not kicking anything. Pearl was still asleep. Wren stood lifting Pearl onto her hip and looked at the hollow one more time, at the curve of stone that had been waiting here since before Colorado was a territory, before there was a road through the Animas Fork Canyon, before anyone had thought to put a name on this piece of the earth. Tomorrow, she said to her children, we begin. That evening on the road from the north side of Copper Bend, a man Wren did not yet know was riding toward the cabin. His name was Jeb Aldrich, and he ran supply freight between Copper Bend and the mining operations east of town, and he had known Cormac Calloway, slightly had drunk coffee with him twice, at the freighter's staging area, had listened to Cormac talk about his wife with the particular warmth of a man who was not performing admiration, but simply reporting what he knew. Jeb was 58, lean in the way of men who had spent decades working rather than worrying, and he operated on the principle that the most useful thing a person could do in most situations was say as little as possible and hand someone what they needed. He knocked at the cabin door after supper. When Wren opened it, he held out a buck saw and a felling hatchet, both well-maintained, both sharp. He said nothing else. Wren looked at the tools, then at the man holding them. She understood what the absence of questions meant. It was the same language her father had used, the language of people who express their judgments not by speaking them, but by acting on them. I'll return them by dusk tomorrow, she said. Jeb nodded once. He handed her the tools and walked back to his wagon. Wren set the saw and hatchet beside the door and went to check on the children who were already asleep. She lay down on the floor quilt in the dark and listened to the sounds of a Colorado night in early October, the creek running fast from snowmelt, the wind through the cottonwood dry leaves, an owl working the hillside above the road. She did not sleep. She was planning. She was calculating, not with dread this time, but with the particular focus her father had given her. The focus of a person who has looked at a problem long enough to see through the size of it to the first step inside it. The first step was the woodshed. The woodshed before anything else, because the wood was the margin between survival and the other thing, and the margin had to be established before she could afford to think about anything beyond it. The arches first. 14 cottonwood or willow saplings, cut green no thicker than her wrist, each 16 feet long. She could cut 8 tomorrow if she started at first light and kept the children working alongside her. The anchor posts would take most of the afternoon 20-inch depth in creek-bottom soil, tamped by hand and boot heel until they held without wobbling. Then the bending, slow, deliberate gravity doing the work that force would crack the wood trying to do. The second day, 4 more arches. By day 3, the frame would be complete and beginning to set. Then the weaving. Willow shoots over and under, each one pulled tight. Before the next was started, the same rhythm her grandmother had used making storage baskets. The same rhythm that had been building shelter in one form or another since before anyone alive could remember. The walls would take 4 days, possibly 5. Then the clay she had seen the deposit upstream 2 years ago on a walk with Cormac, heavy red-brown clay with the fiber and structure that meant it would hold when mixed right. Then the bark shingles cut from the Ponderosa Ridge above overlapped downslope, so the water ran off rather than in. 12 days she calculated, possibly 10 if the weather held. The cold could hold for 52. She had 40 days of margin. She turned on the floor quilt and looked at the ceiling of the cabin she would leave in the morning with its canvas patch above the stove and its gap in the north wall planks and its roof that had been deciding for 2 years whether it intended to keep the weather out or let it in. A young tree remembers what you teach it, her father had written on the first page of his notebook. An old tree has already decided what it knows. Outside, the creek moved over its stones in the dark. The cottonwoods had gone still. The snow that remained on the ground reflected the starlight faintly, so the world beyond the window was not entirely dark, but a dim silver gray, the color of a morning that had not arrived yet. Wren closed her eyes. Tomorrow they would begin. The first arch went up on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October, 1883, while the temperature held just above freezing and the sky had the flat white quality of a system gathering itself for something larger. Wren drove the anchor stakes with the back of the splitting maul. 8 blows per stake, the rhythm consistent, the angle precise because a stake driven crooked transferred its load wrong, and a load transferred wrong became a failure she could not afford in January. The children worked beside her. Ida carried the lighter saplings from the pile she had cut at dawn, 2 at a time balanced across her shoulders, the way Wren had shown her. Amos dragged the heavier ones, his jaw set, with the effort he would not acknowledge as effort. Pearl organized pine needles on her flat rock by length, having determined on the first morning that this was her assigned task, a determination that required neither confirmation nor explanation. The cottonwood sapling went into the left anchor hole first. Wren tamped the earth around it with her boot heel, working in a circle, tightening the soil against the wood until the sapling stood without wobbling when she pushed against it with her full weight. Then she bent it not with force, not with the sudden pressure that would split the grain at the curve, but with the slow, deliberate lean of her body against the arc. The wood wanted to make letting gravity suggest the shape before she insisted on it. The wood was young enough to remember suggestion. She anchored the far end into the right hole, tamped that side step back. A perfect semicircle of living wood 12 feet across its apex, 7 feet above the rocky floor of the hollow, catching the October light along its inner curve. Ida stood beside the first completed arch with her hands folded and her head tilted at an angle that meant she was fitting the reality of the thing against the explanation she had been given. Her voice came out quiet with something that was not quite wonder but was adjacent to it. It looks like a church. Wren had not thought of it that way. She looked at the single arch framed against the hillside, the curve of green wood against gray stone, and saw for a moment what her daughter was seeing. "I suppose it does," she said. Amos was closer than he had been an hour ago. He was not pretending to examine a stone near his boot. He was watching his mother's hands with the focused attention he had once given to watching Cormac work at the forge, the expression of a boy who is filing information in a place he intends to return to. "Why doesn't it break, Mama?" "Because it's young wood, still alive inside. It remembers how to bend." Wren moved to the second sapling. "Old wood has forgotten. Old wood snaps. Will this wood forget? In time. But by the time it forgets, it will have hardened into the shape we gave it." She set the second sapling into its anchor hole. Then it holds that shape for as long as it stands, because that is simply what it is. Amos was silent for a moment, filing this away with the same interior precision his father had used. He picked up one of the lighter saplings from Ida's pile without being asked, set it against the anchor stake on the right side of the second arch position, held it steady while his mother tamped. Wren did not comment on this. She simply worked and he worked beside her, and by mid-afternoon, 4 arches stood in a row across the hollow's mouth. From downstream, a man stopped on the creek path and watched. Garrett Voss was 54 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the slightly uneven gait of a man who had injured his left knee on a railroad survey crew in Wyoming 12 years ago, and had subsequently learned to redistribute his weight in a way that looked like a choice rather than an accommodation. He stood at a respectful distance, hat in his hands, his head tilted at the angle of someone working through a problem he was not yet certain was interesting or merely unfortunate. He studied the framework for nearly 5 full minutes. He looked at the angle of the slope above the hollow, traced the path of a hypothetical snowfall. With his eyes ran what Wren could tell was a load path calculation through whatever engineering instinct he had developed in 20 years of surveying. Something shifted in his expression. Not agreement, not yet, but the specific recalibration of a man who has realized the question is more complicated than his initial assessment allowed. He put his hat back on and walked away. Wren noted it. She noted everything. The morning of the 4th day began without Amos. Wren had woken before dawn, built a small fire under the rock overhang near the canvas shelter she had strung between 2 cottonwoods 30 feet east of the hollow. The previous evening, the night they had left the cabin for the last time, carrying what they needed and leaving what they didn't, set water to boil, walked to the creek to wash her face in water that had developed a skim of ice at the edges overnight. When she returned, Ida was folding the blanket with the neat efficiency she brought to everything her hands touched. Pearl was sitting up, rubbing her face. The space where Amos had been sleeping was flat and cold. His coat was not on its peg, and the absence had the specific quality of something that had been empty for more than a few minutes. "Ida," she kept her voice level, "where is your brother?" Ida looked at the empty space. Her expression shifted in a way Wren did not like. Not surprise, but recognition, as though she had been half waiting for something like this. "He was here when I went to sleep, Mama." Wren checked the hollow first because Amos had taken to hiding in the half-built structure to startle Pearl. He was not there. She walked back toward the cabin, calling his name, her voice carrying in the still cold air. Not there either. She stood at the fork in the creek path, her breath making small white clouds, and felt something pull her east. Not intuition exactly, more like the accumulated knowledge of a mother who had been studying one particular boy for 9 years. She found him at the gate of the Animus Fork Mining Company, speaking with the shift foreman. Amos was standing straight with his shoulders back in the posture of someone who has decided that posture is doing important work. The foreman was a heavy-set man in his 50s who had seen enough to be skeptical of most things, including the claim being made by this particular boy, which was apparently that he was 14 years old. The foreman had not sent him away. He was listening with the expression of a man who finds a situation more interesting than he expected. Wren came through the seat. Amos turned. His face in that moment was not guilt. It was the specific disappointment of a person who has been working towards something and been interrupted before the working had a chance to prove itself. He had come to the mine to get a job. He had come to solve the problem the only way available to a 9-year-old boy who had concluded that the problem required solving by someone in his family, and the adults in his family were not solving it fast enough. Wren thanked the foreman. She put her hand on her son's shoulder, not gripping, just present, and they walked back through the gate together. She did not speak for the first quarter mile. The creek ran to their left, carrying what remained of the previous night's ice skin in broken, translucent pieces. Amos walked with his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes on the path, waiting for what was coming. When they reached the place where the path bent toward the cemetery's eastern edge, Wren stopped walking. "Come with me," she said. Amos looked up. She was already walking toward the iron gate, and after a moment he followed. They sat in the grass of the third row from the back beside the wooden marker that she had not yet been able to replace with stone. The ground was cold through her skirt. The grass around the marker was still green at the base, only frost burned at the tips. A meadowlark was working the brush somewhere behind them, the call carrying in the cold air with the clarity that cold air gave to everything it touched. Amos spoke first, which surprised her. His voice was smaller than his body usually allowed it to be. "I wanted to ask him why he didn't fight harder." Wren did not answer. She let the sentence exist without rushing to correct it. He was the papa. Amos continued the words coming now with the pressure of something that had been stored in a place too small for it. He was supposed to stay, and now we're living in a camp under a tarp, and you're building with sticks, and I don't know why he couldn't just stay. The meadowlark stopped. Wren looked at her husband's grave at the raw wood of the marker she had driven into this ground herself on a morning in April, when the cottonwoods were still bare, and she felt something shift in the closed place in her chest. Not open, not yet, but moving. She felt the anger that had been living behind the closed door, the anger she had locked in with everything else when she sealed herself up on the morning of Cormac's last breath. Angry at Cormac for the $50 he had borrowed without telling her. Angry at the pneumonia that had taken a 46-year-old man in 3 months of progressive cruelty. Angry at the doctor from Denver who had taken the money and the train home. Angry at the winter for coming early at the wood, for being wet at the cabin, for leaking at everything that had conspired to leave her here, with 3 children and $11 and a notebook of her dead father's drawings. The anger was enormous. It filled the space the grief had been occupying, which was every available space she had. Wren Calloway, who had not cried at her husband's burial, who had not cried in 6 months of the hardest arithmetic of her life, began to cry sitting on the cold grass of the Copper Bend Cemetery beside her son. Amos saw it, and whatever bracing he had been doing for the past 6 months dissolved. He cried too, not the angry silent kind he had been doing alone, but the wet open kind that a boy needs a witness for. They sat there at the 3rd row from the back until the meadowlark started up again, until the frost finished melting from the grass around them, until the sun had come fully over the eastern ridge, and the morning was well along. Wren wiped her face on her sleeve, wiped Amos's face on the other sleeve, smoothed his hair back from his forehead with the flat of her palm. "I'm angry at him too," she said. "So angry that I've been carrying it for 6 months without knowing how heavy it was. And I don't know who to tell, and I don't know what to do with it, except I'm telling you now." Amos looked at her. "You're not supposed to be angry at him. He's dead. People don't stop being people when they die. You can be angry at a dead person. I think God understands whatever kind of God is running things." She looked at the marker. "Being angry doesn't mean you stop loving. I think mostly that's what love is at the end of it. The two things together, neither one canceling the other." Amos sat with this for a while, fitting it against the shape of what he had been holding. Then in a different voice, a voice that had released something and felt the lighter for it, "Can we go back and build the woodshed now?" Wren stood. She held out her hand. Amos took it with the hand that had been clenched since April, and they walked back up the path along the creek toward the hollow. The walls took 6 days. Wren worked the willow shoots in the pattern her grandmother had used for storage baskets, the technique older than any building school that had ever been founded on this continent. Over under each shoot, pulled tight before the next one started. Her fingers stiffened in the first cold hour of every morning and loosened as the work warmed them. By the end of the 2nd day, 3 feet of woven lattice curved cleanly from the left edge of the hollow stone face, closing the opening with the tensile strength of interlocked living material, the kind of strength that gave rather than broke, that bent under pressure and recovered rather than failed. Ida watched for a morning before she asked. When she asked, Wren handed her a willow shoot without ceremony. Ida's first weave was crooked. Her second was better. By the 3rd, her hands had found the same rhythm Wren's hands had found at roughly the same age. The same rhythm that had been finding itself in daughters' hands for generations of women who knew that the most durable structures were the ones that moved with the world rather than against it. Amos worked beside them, his contribution at first more energy than precision, but precision came with repetition, and he was his father's son in the way he approached a new skill, quietly, systematically, without announcing the learning. On the 7th day August, Fenwick came. He was perhaps 52, built for the work he had done, heavy through the chest, with hands whose knuckle geography told the whole history of 30 years of stone and timber. He stopped at the edge of the work area and stood with his arms folded, cataloging his expression, the focused flatness of professional observation, rather than casual interest. He watched Wren work for nearly 5 minutes. His voice, when it came, had the particular flatness of a man stating a fact, rather than offering an opinion, waddle and daub. "Yes," Wren said without stopping. "You're from Appalachia." She stopped, looked at him. How did you know? Worked with an old man in Pennsylvania when I was young. He built this way. Most American builders don't know it. He walked the perimeter of the structure, touching the walls at intervals, with his fingertips reading them the way a man reads text in a language he learned long ago. At the back corner where the arches met the rock face. Good thermal mass here. The stone will hold heat 8–10 hours after the fire goes out. That's what I'm counting on. He looked at the stack of ponderosa bark pieces she had cut from the ridge above, prepared for the roof. You're planning to shingle those downslope? Yes. Right overlap direction. That's where water gets in. When people get it wrong, they shingle for looks instead of drainage. He looked at her directly for the first time since arriving. This is going to work, Mrs. Calloway. I know, Mr. Fenwick. He left without ceremony. She heard later that he had mentioned her work at the lumberyard, and the mention had moved through the professional community of men who built things for a living, with the specificity that distinguished it from gossip. He had described the technique, the angle of the snow deflection, the thermal mass calculation. Men who had built things in difficult climates recognized what he was describing. Word moved. On a Thursday in the fourth week of October, Deputy Marshal Calhoun came up the creek path with Declan Calloway. Wren saw them from 50 yards away and knew what they were before they reached her. Declan was walking with his hat in his hands in the way he had walked into the cabin 3 weeks earlier, the brim working between his fingers. The deputy was a large man with a silver star and the patient expression of a man who had been asked to witness something he found distasteful but not outside his duties. Declan would not meet her eyes. Sister, he stopped, started again. Vera said she couldn't wait 60 days. She said if you fail, the tools will be gone to other debts. She said the marshal had to witness. Declan. Wren kept her voice even. Look at me. He looked at her. His face was the color of creek clay. Are you taking Cormac's tools today, not Vera? You. He opened his mouth, closed it, could not answer. Wren walked to the small wooden chest inside the shelter and came back with the hand plane. The 2 chisels, the iron hammer with the hickory handle that Cormac had carried from Kentucky when he was 23 years old. She set them on the ground at the deputy's feet. Her hands were steady. She required them to be steady. Ida had come to the doorway of the canvas shelter. Amos was beside her, holding a piece of split pine. Pearl sat on the flat rock, her pine needle organization abandoned, sensing the change in the air, the way small children sense such things, not understanding it, but responding to it with stillness. From the path behind the group, a voice, Stop. Garrett Voss came around the stand of cottonwoods at a pace that covered ground efficiently. He was carrying a small leather purse. He walked past Declan, past the deputy, and stopped at the wooden chest, looking down at the tools on the ground. He pulled his hat off. Deputy Calhoun. His voice had the level tone of a man who had spent decades making measurements and had learned that precision was more convincing than volume. I'm purchasing these tools from Mrs. Calloway. $55. Witness it if you need to witness something. He opened the purse. He counted the coins onto Pearl's flat rock in the October sunlight, the silver catching the light in a way that made Pearl stare at it instead of her pine needles. Then he looked at Declan. Take 50. It's yours. Tell your wife the debt is paid. Declan looked at the money, looked at Garrett, looked at his sister-in-law, who was looking back at him with an expression that was not anger, which he might have been able to manage, but something quieter than anger, which he found he could not manage at all. I'm sorry, Wren. The words were so small they barely made it across the 5 feet between them. I know you are Declan. He took the $50. He did not touch the tools. He turned and walked back down the path, and the deputy followed, and neither of them looked back. When they were gone, Garrett Voss bent down, picked up the hand plane, turned it over once in his hands, with the care of a man examining something that has been through more than it was built for, set it back down on the ground. On the mem. These are yours, he said. I have no use for a hand plane. Pay me when you have something to pay with. No interest, no deadline. Wren looked at him. He was a man who chose his words the way he would have chosen load-bearing members for function, not for decoration. Mr. Voss, why? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. He looked at the splitting maul leaning against the rock face. He looked at the woodshed, half-clayed, the bark roof not yet begun. He looked at Ida still standing in the shelter doorway with Amos beside her. My wife's name was Mercy. She made quilts 16-hour days some weeks in a room she kept at 60 degrees in winter because she said the cold kept her awake. His voice was level, not performing anything. Nobody ever paid her what the quilts were worth. She didn't care about that. She cared that the children in those houses slept warm. He paused. Mercy would not have forgiven me if I'd stood here today and watched you lose your husband's tools. That's the whole of it. He set his hat back on his head. He walked back down the path toward the road. Wren stood beside the wooden chest for a long time after he was gone. Then she picked up the hand plane and carried it into the shelter, setting it in the place where Cormac had always kept it on the left side of the tool space edge protected handle out. The storm arrived 18 days after the first arch went up, the way major storms arrived in the Animas Fork Canyon, not with warning, but with a pressure change that Wren felt in her sinuses before she saw the clouds banking behind the northern ridge. She spent the afternoon tightening every seal on the dugout they had moved into 5 days earlier, adding a second stone to weight the canvas entry flap, stacking the last of the morning's split wood inside where it would stay dry. By dusk, the first drops of cold rain were hitting the canvas. By 10, the rain had converted to sleet. By midnight, the wind had found its speed. Pearl began making a sound against Wren's neck at 2:30. Not crying, a small involuntary sound, the kind that comes before a person knows they're making it. Wren's hand was on Pearl's forehead before she was fully awake, and what she felt there drove the last of the sleep from her immediately. The heat under her palm was extraordinary. Not the modest warmth of a child's fever, but something that seemed to belong to a furnace rather than a small body. The doctor in Copper Bend was 5 miles north on a road that was currently a river of ice in a storm running at 45 miles an hour. Wren calculated it in the time it took her to unwrap Pearl from the blanket and press a wet cloth from the water bucket to the child's forehead. The calculation took 4 seconds and produced one answer. She stayed. Ida. Her voice was quiet. Ida was awake before the name finished. I need you to go out and build the fire up under the rock overhang, all the way up. Can you do that? Ida was already pulling her coat on. She went out into the sleet without another word, the canvas flap letting in a blast of frozen air that made Pearl whimper. Amos! Amos was sitting up, his face pale in the lamplight, his eyes on his sister's still face. Sit here. Hold Pearl's hand. Talk to her about anything, the stones in the creek, the hawk we saw yesterday, anything. Keep her voice engaged. Do you understand? Amos moved to Pearl's side and took her hand in both of his. His voice started up immediately, low and steady. Pearl, there's this stone I found last week near the second bend. It's got iron in it. You can tell from the orange streak along the bottom. Papa used to say you can always find iron by looking for where the orange lives in the rock. Wren worked. She stripped Pearl's sweat-soaked shift and wrapped her in the driest cloth she had, then worked cold water to the child's forehead, her neck, her wrists where the veins ran close to the surface. The technique came from her father, learned from a woman in the Tennessee Highlands who had brought 3 children through a fever summer in 1854 with nothing but patience, cold water, and the refusal to accept what seemed inevitable. Then she sang. The lullaby had no composer anyone had ever named. It had come to Wren from her mother, who had it from her mother, who had brought it west from Virginia before the war. Wren sang it low, her mouth close to the top of Pearl's head, the words less important than the vibration, the continuous human presence of sound, in a body that was fighting something larger than it was. Ida came back in from the sleet with red cheeks and wet hair and reported the fire was built full. She settled in beside her mother, without being asked, her shoulder warm against Wren's arm. And the 3 of them, mother and 2 older children, held the youngest between them through the long, dark middle of the storm, while the wind drove sleet against the hillside and a tree came down somewhere up the canyon with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. Wren sang for 2 hours. At 5 in the morning, Pearl's breathing changed, deepened, slowed from the shallow, quick rhythm it had been running at for 3 hours into something longer. At 5:30, the fever broke. At 6, Wren placed her palm on her daughter's forehead and found it warm, the ordinary warmth of a sleeping child, not the extraordinary heat of a body in crisis. She stopped singing. She sat in the dugout with her daughter in her arms, Ida asleep against her shoulder. Amos stretched across her knees, the wind outside still working, but the sleet having given way to snow, the first gray light of the canyon morning beginning to lift the dark by slow degrees. She did not cry this time. What she felt was not the same thing she had felt at the cemetery with Amos. That had been grief breaking open the release of something held too long. This was different, harder, quieter, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been asked to make an impossible choice, made it, and been lucky. She understood with absolute clarity that luck was part of what had happened, that she had held her daughter and sung for 2 hours, and the fever had broken, and in another version of this same night it might not have. And the singing would have been the same, but the outcome different, and she would have had to find a way to live in that version too. She did not speak to God. She spoke to her father. Father, she said the Tennessee word for it, the word that had meant Elias Pratt rather than any distant authority. Thank you. At 8 o'clock, she carried Pearl out to the hollow to check the woodshed. The child was weak, but awake, her arms around her mother's neck, watching the snow-covered canyon, with the wondering detachment of someone newly returned from somewhere they couldn't quite describe. The woodshed walls were intact. The bark roof had not leaked. The clay on the windward side had darkened with moisture, but had not cracked. Wren reached inside and pulled a piece of pine from the middle of the stack, pressed her thumbnail into the end grain. Dry. The stack beneath the bark roof had come through the first serious test exactly as she had calculated it would. She set Pearl down on the flat rock, which now wore 3 inches of snow that Pearl immediately began to rearrange. Later that afternoon, Garrett Voss came up the path carrying a glass bottle. He set it on Pearl's flat rock. Fresh milk, which in Colorado in late October was worth considerably more than its weight in most things. I heard the little one was sick, he said. I hope she's better. She's better. I'm glad to hear it. He looked at the woodshed which had come through the storm with the composure of something that had been built to do exactly what it had just done. He looked back at Wren. Mrs. Calloway, I owe you an apology. For what, Mr. Voss? For standing at the edge of your work area 2 weeks ago and running through a load calculation to see where it would fail. A pause. It didn't fail. No, Wren said. It didn't. He nodded once and turned down the path. Wren watched him go, and beside her, Ida, who had come out to stand in the weak afternoon sun, said quietly, Why does that man keep coming back, Mama? Wren thought about it honestly before answering. Because he's been lonely for a long time, and lonely people recognize each other. Ida considered this with the same careful attention she gave to everything she intended to remember. Then she picked up the bottle of milk and carried it inside to her sister. That night, for the first time in 11 nights, Wren Calloway slept more than 2 hours in a row. The following Sunday, Silas Holt preached about people who chose caves over Christian community. He did not say Wren's name. He did not need to. By Monday morning, the sermon's target was understood by everyone in Copper Bend who attended the Methodist Church, and by Tuesday word had reached those who did not. Ida came home from school that afternoon with her eyes red from something more than the cold. She did not say anything immediately. She put down her book, took off her coat, sat on the edge of the bed. Mama, she said finally, the girls at school called me something today. Wren waited. They called me the cave woman's daughter. The room was very quiet. And Mrs. Hedges at the general store told me she couldn't sell us the fabric you asked me to pick up. She wouldn't say why. She just said she couldn't. Ida looked at her hands. I stood there with the money, and she looked at the wall behind me and said she was sorry she couldn't. Wren sat down beside her daughter. She did not rush to fill the silence with reassurance. She let Ida sit in the shape of what had happened because some things needed to be sat with before they could be moved through. Then she went to the shelf where Elias Pratt's notebook lived and brought it back to the table. She opened it past the arch diagrams, past the clay compositions, past the bark roofing drawings to a blank page near the back. She took a piece of charcoal from beside the stove and began to draw. She drew a cross-section of the woodshed. She drew the angle of an incoming snowfall, 28 degrees, the actual angle of the slope above the hollow, and showed how the mass redirected around the dome rather than loading onto it. She drew the thermal mass diagram of the rock face with arrows indicating the heat retention hours. She drew the load distribution of the woven willow wall, showing how the interlocking structure distributed force across its full surface, rather than concentrating it at any single point. She drew until there was no more room on the page. She turned to the next page and drew more. Ida, she said, tomorrow morning you take this notebook to school. When those girls call you that name, you open this book. You show them what your grandfather knew. You show them the calculations. She looked at her daughter. Knowledge is a shield. A small one, but it's real. The ones who can read these drawings will understand. The ones who can't will understand that you are not someone they can easily dismiss. Ida looked at the pages. Her eyes had dried. Something in her posture had shifted. What if they still call me names? Then they call you names and you come home and we think about what to do next. You don't have to be strong about this tomorrow, Ida. You only have to go. Ida took the notebook and set it on the shelf beside her coat. She did not sleep easily that night. Wren heard her turning, heard her get up once for water, but she did not ask for anything, and Wren did not offer anything, because she understood that there were things a 12-year-old needed to work through in the privacy of her own dark without a mother smoothing the edges. The following Saturday, 3 girls walked up the creek path from the direction of the school. They stopped at the edge of the hollow and stared at the structure with the wide-eyed attention of children who have traveled some distance to see something they have heard about and are now trying to reconcile the story with the reality. Ida came out of the dugout. She looked at the 3 girls. They looked at her. "Do you want to see how the arch works?" Ida said. She showed them. She explained the load distribution, the snow deflection angle, the reason the woven wall was stronger under pressure than a board wall of the same thickness. She let them touch the clay. She showed them the thermal mass diagram in her grandfather's notebook. By the time their mothers called them home in the late afternoon, 3 girls had received, without any of them quite realizing it, a lesson in the physics of structure. Wren watched from the doorway of the dugout and said nothing, but something in her chest opened a fraction further. The word came to Wren the way most news traveled in Copper Bend sideways through the freight network that moved faster than any telegraph wire strung between the mining camps. Jeb Aldrich stopped his wagon at the hollow's entrance on a Wednesday afternoon. In the first week of November, climbed down with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had decided what he was going to say and saw no reason to rush towards saying it. A family had come in on the afternoon train. Man, woman, 4 children. The woman was visibly pregnant, 8th month by the look of it, which meant she had made whatever journey brought her here in a condition that did not invite long travel. The man's name was Roy Marsh. He had worked the mines east of Ridgeway until a tunnel collapse in September had done something to his shoulder and back that the company doctor had described as temporary, but that had not yet shown any interest in becoming temporary. They had been directed to the basement of the Copper Bend Methodist Church. Their wood supply, as reported by the church's sexton, was approximately 2 weeks if they were careful. Roy Marsh had not been able to cut since September. Jeb delivered all of this with the same neutral register he applied to road conditions and weather reports. Then he climbed back onto his wagon. "Thank you, Mr. Aldrich," Wren said. He nodded once and drove away. Wren stood at the hollow's entrance holding the piece of pine she had been inspecting when he arrived. She looked at the woodshed, the stacks she had built with Amos through October, the careful rows of split pine she had calculated down to the last cord. She looked at the margin she had built into those calculations. Then she set the pine down, told Ida to keep the fire banked, put on her coat, and walked the 4 miles to the Methodist church in the early dark of a November evening. The church basement was low-ceilinged, lit by a single lamp on an iron hook near the entry, the kind of light that created more shadow than it resolved. The smell was cold stone and old ash from a fireplace that had not been cleaned since the previous winter. 3 children were arranged in the far corner, a girl of about 8 with the watchful stillness of a child who has learned to conserve everything. A boy of 6, a girl of 4, who had fallen asleep sitting upright against the older girl's arm. 2 thin blankets between the 3 of them, pulled and distributed with the practiced efficiency of children who had been sharing insufficient warmth for some time. Roy Marsh lay on a plank bed along the right wall. His eyes were closed. His breathing was audible from across the room, not labored in the way of a man in immediate crisis, but conscious, working the sound of a body that was managing something heavier than it had been built for. He was perhaps 42. He had the bone structure of a man who had been strong for a long time, which made the current inventory of his situation read as a subtraction rather than an original condition. Della Marsh sat on the floor beside the plank with her back against the stone wall, both hands resting on the full roundness of her belly, her legs extended before her. She was 38 years old, with the kind of face that had been good-looking before the past several months had drawn on it heavily. Her eyes, when they came up at the sound of Wren's entrance, were clear in the particular way of someone who has made a complete and unsentimental accounting of their situation and arrived at a number they are not dramatizing. Wren stood in the middle of the basement floor. "How much wood do you have?" Della's voice was steady as Riverstone. "2 weeks if we're careful. Roy hasn't been able to cut since September. You need 4 cords minimum to make it to April." "I know that." A pause, the pause of someone who has already completed this calculation many times. "I don't know who would sell to us on terms we could meet." The 3 children in the corner had gone still in the way children go still when adult conversations turn to the subject of resources, not from comprehension exactly, but from instinct. The body understanding before the mind does that this is a moment that requires less space. The older girl Callie Wren would learn, watched Wren with the measuring attention she had evidently developed from the same necessity that produced her stillness. Wren looked at the children. She looked at Della. She thought about the margin in her woodshed calculation, the extra she had built in, because her father had taught her that, in mountain winters, the margin was not a luxury, but a structural element. "I'm building 2 additional storage structures before spring," Wren said. "I need workers. I'm paying in firewood instead of cash because cash is not what I have in surplus either. A day of stacking from your children buys a week's worth of split pine. They stack, I cut. Does that seem reasonable?" Della looked at Wren with an expression that held steady through several seconds of quiet. Both women understood the exchange rate being offered was more generous than the work would command in any fair market transaction. Neither of them commented on this understanding. It existed between them without needing to be named. "I'm Della Marsh," she said. "My husband is Roy. That's Callie, Owen, and May." Her voice carried the full weight of what she was about to say. "I accept your offer with my whole heart, Mrs. Calloway." Wren nodded once. She looked at Callie in the corner. "Can you carry a piece of firewood the length of your forearm?" Callie nodded, her eyes serious. "Then you start tomorrow. I'll send my daughter Ida to show you the stacking pattern." Wren walked home in the dark along the creek path. The temperature was 11 degrees. The stars over the Animas Fork Canyon had the dense specific population that only appeared on the coldest clear nights, as though the cold had pressed the sky into sharper resolution. She was thinking about Roy Marsh's breathing and about Cormac's breathing in March of that year, which had had a similar quality, not the same illness, but the sound of a body working against an addition to its ordinary load. She was thinking about what it meant to build something small enough that you could see all of its edges and then discover it was large enough for more than you had designed it to hold. Through November, a pattern established itself. Mornings, Wren cut. Afternoons, Ida walked to the church basement to teach Callie Marsh the stacking pattern, the air gaps that prevented moisture transfer between splits, the alternating directions that created structural stability in the pile, the way to read the end grain for moisture content by color. Callie was 8 years old and absorbed the teaching the way certain children absorbed everything completely without apparent effort, as though the information had been waiting somewhere in her, and the lesson was simply the occasion for it to surface. Owen stacked what his 6-year-old arms could carry. May 4 sorted kindling by size, with a seriousness that suggested she had been appointed to this role by an authority no one else could see. By the end of November, 1 cord occupied the corner of the basement. By mid-December, 2 cords. The basement was warmer. Roy Marsh was sitting up. Ida and Callie had become inseparable in the way of children who recognize in each other something they did not know they were missing. Callie was quieter, more watchful, 3 years younger, and Ida had discovered, apparently to her own surprise, that she had things she wanted to teach. She taught Callie the stacking. She taught her the arch geometry she had learned at the Hollow. She showed her the pages of Elias Pratt's notebook that dealt with snow load calculations, tracing the diagrams with her finger while Callie followed. What moved between them was something older than either of them. The transfer of knowledge from one girl to another, the specific warmth of a chain that did not intend to end with the person currently holding it. On the 7th of January, Roy Marsh died before dawn. Della woke at 4 in the morning when his breathing changed in a way that she recognized not from experience, but from the body's knowledge of things it has not been told. She sat beside him until it stopped at 4:47. She sat beside him for another hour after it stopped, in the specific stillness of a woman who has been preparing for a thing and discovered that preparation does not actually reduce the size of the thing when it arrives. She let the children sleep. At 6, she sent Callie to find Ida. Ida ran home through the January cold, and her face, when she came through the canvas flap, told Wren everything before any words did. Wren reached the church basement at 7. Silas Holt was already there. His Bible open to the 34th Psalm, reading in the voice he reserved for these occasions, measured resonant, carrying the weight of the words without performing it. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. His voice was steadier than Wren had heard it before. She stood near the basement door with her hat in her hands and watched his face as he read and saw for the first time what she had not been able to see from the position of someone he had preached against. She saw a man who had lost someone a long time ago and who had organized his entire ministry around the terror of that loss, repeating in himself or in anyone within his reach. He had come to her cabin in October because he was afraid of burying her. He had preached against her in November because her success had begun to change something in the community's understanding of what a widow could do, and change of that kind unsettled the system he had built to manage his fear. He was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one, which was something different, something that could be worked with. His eyes moved briefly to the corner of the basement, where two cords of dry pine stood in the careful stacking pattern Ida had taught Callie. They did not linger. They did not look away cleanly either. He finished the service, closed his Bible, looked once at Wren across the room, 1 second deliberate, then went upstairs. Della sat beside her husband for another hour after the room had emptied of everyone but Wren. Then she stood. She smoothed her apron with the flat of both hands, a gesture that looked like composure being chosen rather than possessed. She looked at her children, who were awake now, arranged in a line of descending height, against the far wall, their faces holding the particular blankness of children who have understood something they did not want to understand. Children. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. Your papa has gone to be with God. We are going to live now. That is what he would want. We are going to live and be kind and remember him. Callie walked across the room and put her hand in her mother's hand without a word. May began to cry, not loudly, just the small, steady leaking of a 4-year-old's grief. Wren picked May up and held her, the child's face pressing warm against her neck, and stood in the middle of the basement floor, holding someone else's daughter the way she had held her own children on the morning after Cormac, and understood that grief at a certain depth stopped belonging to one person. On the 20th of February, Silas Holt came to the hollow. He did not stand at a distance. He walked directly to the mouth of the hollow, removed his hat at the threshold, and held it at his side. He was 50 years old and looked in the February light like a man who had arrived somewhere after a journey he had not expected to take. Mrs. Calloway, he said, I said things about you from my pulpit that I now have to unsay. I'm not coming to ask your forgiveness. You owe me nothing, and I have no right to request it. I'm coming to tell you that I was afraid. I've buried 3 widows in this valley. 2 of them froze to death in shelters they insisted were adequate. One of them I found in February with tears on my face before I could walk back to my horse. His voice did not waver. I made my fear your problem. That was wrong. Wren let the silence hold for a moment after he finished. Not as punishment, she did not operate by punishment, but because what he had said deserved the weight of being received before it was responded to. Reverend Holt, she said, I accept your apology, not because I'm required to, because I've been afraid myself this winter, and I know what fear does to a person's judgment when they let it make decisions for them. Something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, but the specific release of a man who has been carrying something at arm's length for weeks and has just been permitted to set it down. Will you come in? I have coffee. He came in. He sat at the small table Wren had built from salvaged planks. He met the children, Ida with her notebook of geometry, Amos, who shook his hand with the gravity of a boy who had decided to practice being serious, Pearl, who climbed into his lap without asking, because Pearl had never successfully identified a lap she was not entitled to. He asked Amos what he wanted to be when he grew up. Amos looked at the woodshed through the dugout's small window and said he wanted to build houses for people who needed them. Holt said that was one of the finest things he could think to want. He did not become a close friend, but the territory between them, which had been occupied by his fear and her resistance to it, was cleared, and something quieter moved in where those things had been. Garrett Voss came the following Sunday, as he had come the 2 Sundays before. He brought a book of plain geometry for Ida, the real kind, Euclid's propositions, in a cloth-bound volume with marginalia from a previous owner that Ida immediately began reading with more attention than she gave the main text. He brought a wooden interlocking puzzle for Amos, the kind that came apart only if you understood the structure before you began. He brought for Pearl nothing except his patient, unhurried attention, which turned out to be precisely what Pearl had been requiring without anyone having identified it yet. He stayed for supper twice in the weeks that followed, did not stay the other times, and the pattern of his presence became part of the household's rhythm without any conversation about whether it should be. He never asked Wren for anything. He came and sat and sometimes spoke and sometimes read and went home to his own small house in Copper Bend at the end of each visit. They were two people who had learned each by a different route that the most sustainable companionship was the kind that did not require either person to diminish themselves to maintain it. On the 1st of March 1884, Della Marsh's labor began in the basement of the Copper Bend Methodist Church. The midwife from the east side of town arrived at noon and reported throughout the afternoon that the process was long but uncomplicated. The baby in a good position, the mother managing with the specific competence of a woman who had done this before under better circumstances and had simply brought her competence with her into worse ones. Wren was there because Della had asked her to be there, the request coming through Callie 2 days earlier with the directness that characterized everything in the Marsh household. Ida sat with Callie against the basement wall, their shoulders touching, talking in low voices about things Wren could not hear. Amos had taken Owen outside to look at the early March stars, explaining the constellations he had learned from his grandfather's notebook, by way of his mother's telling the Great Bear the Hunter, the river of the Milky Way. May slept in Pearl's arms, the two of them curled together on a folded blanket, Pearl having appointed herself May's guardian, with the same unilateral authority she applied to all her important decisions. At 7:12 in the evening, Della Marsh's daughter was born. She announced her arrival with the full volume of healthy lungs, and the basement, which had been the site of Roy Marsh's death 53 days earlier, filled with the sound of a new person insisting on her presence in the world. The midwife finished her work. The room settled. Della held her daughter in the dim light, the baby's face still new with the effort of arrival, and looked at her with the long, quiet look of a woman who has just done the largest thing a body can be asked to do. When she finally looked up, she found Wren across the room. In 38 years, Della said her voice was tired, the tiredness of someone who has been working at depth for many hours, but underneath it was something clear, something that had been waiting for the right moment. No one has ever looked at a thing they made and decided to name it after me. My mother named me for a woman she didn't like. Roy called me Dell because Della was too long when he was tired. A pause. The baby made a small sound against her chest, a sound of inventory of assessing the new conditions. I want to name my daughter Wren. Her middle name is Roy for her father, Wren Roy Marsh. The room was very quiet. I'm asking your permission, Della continued, because it's your name, and because I want you to know I'm not naming her for what you did for us. I'm naming her for what you did for yourself. So my daughter grows up knowing that there are women in this world who don't wait to be saved. They build. And sometimes what they build turns out to be large enough for more people than they planned. Wren did not answer immediately. She sat with what had just been given to her, the specific gift of being seen, not for the difficulty she had managed or the help she had provided, but for the fact of having stood in her own life without waiting for someone else to authorize it. I would be honored, Della, she said, and her voice was thicker than she intended. She crossed the room. She sat down beside Della on the plank bed, close enough that their shoulders touched, and looked at the face of the child who would carry her name into a century she herself would not see all the way through. The baby's eyes were closed. Her small hands were fisted in the particular posture of new humans who have not yet decided what to do with hands. Wren Calloway, who had cried at the cemetery in October, and not since cried for the second time. Not from grief and not from relief, but from the complicated, specific emotion that arrives when something you did not know you needed is given to you freely by someone who understood your need before you did. She cried the way a door opens that has been closed very long. Not all at once, not with violence, but with the particular releasing sound of something that had been held shut by pressure, not by lock. Ida came and sat on her mother's other side. She rested her head against Wren's shoulder and said nothing, which was exactly right. Outside the basement window, March stars were beginning to show through the clearing weather. The fire came in the first week of April when the snowmelt had left the lower slopes green, but the upper ridges still dry from a winter that had taken the moisture out and not yet put it back. A logging crew working the eastern canyon had left their noon fire incompletely extinguished, a commonplace carelessness that in dry conditions became something else entirely. The smoke reached the hollow before the sound did that particular smell of burning pine resin that sat on the back of the throat and told a person without any ambiguity that the news was serious. Wren came out of the dugout and read the smoke's direction against the wind. The fire was running the eastern slope feeding uphill with the speed that fires achieved on steep grades angling northwest on the canyon wind. She calculated the trajectory. The hollow sat low on the western canyon wall, protected by the angle of the hillside above it, but the dry grass between the tree line and her structure was exactly the kind of continuous fuel that carried fire from intention to consequence. She did not wait. She called for her children. They worked with the splitting maul and the hatchet, breaking the dry grass line 20 feet out from the hollow's entrance, scraping the surface clear down to the bare creek-bottom soil that would not carry flame. The technique was page 23 of Elias Pratt's notebook, Fire Behavior, on Slope Terrain, the counterintuitive necessity of destroying the fuel in the path of the fire before the fire arrived to do its own version of the same thing. Wren had read that page in October and set it in the place in her memory where she kept things she might need urgently at an inconvenient time. Garrett Voss came around the cottonwood stand at a pace that covered ground with intention. August Fenwick was with him, having evidently been at the surveyor's office when the smoke appeared. Neither of them had been called. They arrived the way people arrived who had been paying enough attention to understand that this was a moment requiring additional hands rather than additional conversation. They worked for 2 hours, 4 adults, and Amos, who had appointed himself to the task with a focus that did not acknowledge the possibility of being redirected. Pearl kept Mae Marsh, who had been visiting with Callie when the smoke appeared back at the Flat Rock, with the firm authority of a 6-year-old who has identified a responsible role. Ida and Callie worked the outer edge of the fire break, with the rakes extending the cleared line toward the tree line on the north side. The fire reached the cleared ground at the 3-hour mark and stopped. It stopped with the specific indifference of a thing that had been moving in one direction until the conditions changed, at which point it simply ceased to be interested. The wind shifted west. The smoke began to thin. Wren stood at the hollow's entrance and looked at the woodshed. Intact. The clay walls had not caught. The bark roof had not ignited. The arches she had bent and set in October stood in the cleared space, with the composure of structures that had been designed for duration rather than for particular conditions. Garrett stood beside her, looking at the same thing. His coat had a burn mark on the left sleeve from an ember he had caught and stopped. He took his hat off and held it at his side, looking at the woodshed in the way a man looks at something he has finished reconsidering. "Your father taught you well, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "He did, Mr. Voss." The canyon carried the words up the slope and away into the clear April air above the smoke line. On a September morning in 1908, 25 years after the first arch went up, Wren Calloway walked the creek path along the Animas Fork one more time. She was 69 years old. Her hair had been entirely white for a decade. Her hands, always larger than other women's, were heavier now at the knuckles, the accumulated interest of a lifetime's physical work, but they still functioned. She still split her own kindling. She had not yet found a reason to stop. She opened the door of the old woodshed. The structure had weathered into the hillside over 25 years until the clay and the stone and the lichen were nearly indistinguishable from one another, the built thing and the natural thing having arrived over time at a common language. Inside the willow frame had long since hardened into its permanent shape the wood that had been green in 1883, now carrying its curve as though it had grown that way from the beginning. She set 4 photographs on the ledge of rock at the back wall. Ida, 37, teaching school in a small town in eastern Kansas. Married to a carpenter she had met at a church picnic and recognized she had written by the way he looked at a structure before he looked at the people inside it. 2 children. 3 letters a year to her mother every year since she left, none of them late. Amos, 34, building small houses in New Mexico for mining families who could not afford to hire help at prevailing rates. He had spent his mid-20s drinking in a way that had frightened Wren through his letters, even when he tried to minimize it, and he had stopped with help on the far side of his 29th birthday. And he wrote to his mother every month now, not to reassure her, but because he had apparently decided that regular contact was one of the structures worth maintaining. He had not married. He seemed in the photographs content. Pearl, 31, a nurse in Denver, newly married in the photograph, laughing with the uncomplicated joy of someone who has not yet had cause to learn that joy requires protecting. She had her father's eyes and her grandmother's hands, The large, capable hands that skipped a generation in families, sometimes appearing where they were most needed. The fourth was a letter, not a photograph. From Renroy Marsh, 24 years old, writing from Wyoming Territory, where she was working as a carpenter who had 3 months earlier started directing the work rather than assisting it. She had a crew of 3 women. She used the clay mixture her mother had taught her, which Della had learned from watching Wren work, which Wren had taken from Elias Pratt's notebook, which Elias Pratt had learned from watching the men who built shelters in the mountains before him. Aunt Wren, the letter said, I thought you should know that the hollow I built last spring is still standing after the winter. Callie sends her love. She says to tell Ida she still thinks about the arch lesson. Wren stood in the hollow for a while with the photographs around her. She put her palm flat against the back wall. The same gesture, the same wall, the same cold, solid resistance of rock that had been here since before anyone arrived to need it. Father, she said quietly to Elias Pratt, who had been dead for 51 years, and whom she had been talking to irregularly ever since. I hope I did it right. She closed the door of the woodshed. She walked back down the path toward the house she had built in 1886, with money earned from teaching 6 families in the Animas Fork Valley the techniques in her father's notebook. The house had a real roof, a proper chimney, a kitchen large enough to move in. It was hers in the specific way that only things you have built yourself are yours, not legally, not on paper, but in the grain of the wood, in the set of the stone, and the calculation behind every joint. Garrett Voss was on the porch. He was 79 years old, his hair the white of creek limestone, his bad knee no better than it had been in October of 1883. He was reading the morning paper with the unhurried attention of a man who had arrived at an age where news was something he observed rather than participated in. A cup of tea sat on the small table beside his chair, still steaming. He looked up when she came up the porch steps. Tea's on. Thank you, Garrett. She sat down in the chair beside him. The September light was doing what September light did in the Animas Fork Canyon, coming in at the long angle that made everything it touched look considered as though the whole landscape had arranged itself to be seen at this particular hour. He had never asked her to marry him. She had never asked why. They had worked out between them over 23 years of Sunday breakfasts, an arrangement that fit the specific shapes of 2 people who had already been one person's essential person and had discovered that what they had available afterward was something quieter than that, but not lesser. He kept his own house in town. He ate breakfast with her on Sundays. He went home in the afternoons. They had kept their separate lives and shared the particular peace that comes when 2 people stop requiring each other to be anything other than what they are. I went up to the old hollow, she said. I thought you might. He turned a page of the paper without looking at it. Is it still standing? Of course it is. A meadowlark started up somewhere behind the garden, the same call or one indistinguishable from the ones she had been hearing in this canyon for 25 years, carrying across the September morning with the clarity that autumn air gave to everything it touched. Garrett. She was looking at the cottonwoods across the yard, at the yellow that was just beginning at the tips of the leaves, the color that meant October was coming back around again. Do you ever wonder what Mercy would have thought of all this? He folded the paper, set it on the table, looked out at the same cottonwoods for a long time, and she did not rush him. I think, he said finally, she would have come to sit with you. First week of October 1883, she would have walked up that creek path with a quilt over her arm. She would have sat down at the mouth of that hollow and not said very much, and she would have stayed until she was sure you knew someone was there. He paused. That was what she did with the women she recognized. I wish I'd known her. Garrett looked at her, then the direct look of a man who has something true to say and has decided to say it. You have Wren. You've been knowing her every Sunday for 23 years. Wren reached over and took his hand. His hand was warm, the skin loose over the bones, the way skin became over a long life of use. They sat like that while the meadowlark worked its way through the brush behind the garden, while the September light moved its slow angle across the yard, while the cottonwoods held their color for one more morning before the season began the work of changing them. Inside, the tea was getting cold. She would go in and pour it out and set fresh water to boil because that was what Sunday mornings were for, and it was nearly Sunday, and there was no reason she could think of not to do the ordinary things with the same care she had always brought to the extraordinary ones. But first she sat. She sat beside the man who had counted out $55 on a flat rock in October and never asked for anything in return. She sat with the letters from her children on the mantel inside, and the photograph of a young woman named Ren Roy Marsh on the wall beside them. She sat in the house she had built on the ground she had earned by doing the first thing, then the next thing, then the thing after that until the winter was behind her. The hillside had not remembered her name by accident. It remembered because she had pressed her palm into it and refused to move because she had bent green wood into an arch and held it until the wood decided that was its shape, because she had worked clay into lattice and called it a wall and made it one. 25 years later, other hillsides and other valleys were learning other names because knowledge moved the way water moved, finding its path forward, always downhill, always continuing, never asking permission to go on. Her father had told her once, sitting on a rock face in the Tennessee Highlands, while she was 7 years old with her palm pressed to the stone beside his, that the only limit in any material was the understanding of the person working with it. She had been working with materials ever since stonewood clay, the living material of children who grew into people, the brittle material of men who were afraid, the flexible material of women who bent rather than broke and remembered their shape when the bending was done. She had built a small thing in a hillside in October of 1883. The small thing had been large enough. Large enough had been sufficient. Sufficient in the end had been everything.